Now, one of the things that we haven't really discussed on this show very much are universal role-playing systems. So today, I thought I would explore what I think is one of the best and offer up a comprehensive tutorial on exactly how to play this game. So at the end of this video, you can sit down and immediately start playing it. I'll also explain why, near the end of the video, why I think this is one of the best RPG systems ever created. And with that, I introduce you to Masterbook. Now, this was released by West End Games back in 1994, but now it's available through Precis Intermedia. I'll put a link in the description. The Masterbook was developed from a system originally used by the Torg RPG. It was intended to greatly expand West End Games' existing D6 system. Now, there were other settings and scenarios released for this. For instance, Blood Shadows. This is one of the first one. It was like a fantasy noir setting with gangsters and monsters and this kind of thing. Also, Indiana Jones, right? The world of Indiana Jones. It was a big IP that West End Games managed to score, and they produced a lot of content for Indiana Jones, which is really cool, including supplements that were based on the movies. Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Last Crusade, Temple of Doom, this kind of thing. In addition to those scenarios, there was also the world of Necroscope was released in 1995, the world of Aiden, which was a fantasy setting, the world of Species based on the movie, Tank Girl, and Tales from the Crypt. Now, there's also a limited edition collector's book that was released by West End Games, which contained the core rules, Blood Shadows, and Indiana Jones. And near the end of this video, I'll show you a really quick kind of unboxing to take a look at that book. It's pretty neat. But for now, let's jump into the rules and see how this system actually works. So let me bring this up and make it a little bigger so that we can see what we're doing here. Now, this system, the Masterbook system, is quite a bit different than D6, and this is the fundamental mechanic, right? The core mechanic of the system, and is based on difficulty numbers that you have to meet or beat using a 2d10 roll. Now, keep in mind, this is not a percentile system. It's actually a 2d10 roll. And if we look up here in the upper left-hand corner, there is an arbitrary DN scale for difficulties based on what we're trying to do. So for instance, if a difficulty level is nearly routine, the DN is only going to be a 2, but if it's very, very difficult, it might be a 12, or extremely hard, it might be an 18. Now, when we roll these dice, if we roll a 0, which is a 10 on one of them, we can roll again, but only if our character, which we will see, is skilled in that area or has a specialization in that area. So there is an exploding dice mechanic, but it's a contextual exploding dice mechanic. So it doesn't always apply. You can't just sit down, roll some 10s and do something spectacular, even if you have no training and no skill in that area. Now, if we look down at the bottom of this slide here, we see there's something called a bonus chart. Now, when we roll the dice, what we're doing is we're trying to generate a bonus number that will be added or subtracted if we roll poorly. If you look on that chart, if you roll, for instance, like a 4, right, you get a -7. But if you roll a 17, you get a +6. You either add it or subtract it to your skill plus any specializations you might have in that area. So let's look at an example here. Your PC, let's say a detective, has a 10 dexterity and 1 skill add in fire combat. You roll a 10 and a 3. The 10 is rolled again, right, giving you another 3. Remember, he has a skill in fire combat, so he's able to roll again. So the 10 is rolled again for another 3, giving you a 16. You then look at the bonus chart at the bottom, and you see that you get a bonus of +5, giving you a skill total of 16. Now, there are some things that can, prevent you from rolling again. There's something called a stymied condition, which I'm going to talk about later. A stymied condition, if you have that, means you sacrifice your first reroll. So if you roll that 10, you can't re-roll it. There's also something called life points that you get in the game that can allow you to get a reroll, but the enemy can use their life points to cancel it. Now, keep in mind, if you are the GM, you have to keep track of these conditions during the round, right? Make sure you understand, who's stymied and this kind of thing. So that is the core mechanic. So let's now turn our attention to PC creation. Now, PC creation is pretty simple for the most part. You start with 68 points to distribute among 8 attributes. The 8 attributes, let's do this. Let's flip over here to an example here. You see the attributes up here on the left-hand corner of our fantasy warrior, which we'll return to in a moment. She has agility, dexterity, endurance, strength, intellect, mind, confidence, and charisma. So that's a lot of attributes. There's a lot more than a typical RPG system because there's a lot of granularity in the Masterbook system. So some of these are very obvious, right, and straightforward, like agility or dexterity, but like something like mind, that a lot of times is used for like casting magical spells, or it might be used for really high level intellectual stuff like medicine. Confidence is used for instance, trying to intimidate people or taunt them or to persuade them, this kind of thing. So we have our attributes, going back to this. We split up our points, and then we look at our derived attributes. So when we look at our, like say, our strength and our endurance, we can use those to calculate how many toughness points we get. That's in the bottom left hand on this slide here. Toughness is important because it's going to limit how much damage we take when we suffer a blow or a gunshot wound or something like this. There is also another derived attribute that has to do with your movement. Now, rounds in this game are combat rounds, basically, are 10 seconds in length, and distances are measured in meters. You'll notice there in that slide that there are these like acronyms like MRG and it was MRS for swimming. These are your movement rates based on if you're swimming, climbing, or moving on the ground. And again, they're measured in meters. During combat, as we'll see later, you're actually able to move twice your max movement rate on the ground and perform a complex action. Then you calculate your life points. And then finally, we have the meat and bones of this whole thing, the skill adds and skill points. So the number of skill points you get is based on your intellect and your mind. And once you have those skill points, what you can do is you can start allocating them how you see fit. So here is a list, right, of the Masterbook skill list. So we're in character creation here. There's agility-based skills like beast riding or climbing or flight. And then there's dexterity-based skills, intellect, right, computer ops, charisma and confidence. Charisma, for instance, persuasion or confidence, conning somebody, right, trying to fool them. And you'll notice the ones that are in boldface on this list are skills that you cannot use untrained. So I can't just, if I'm untrained, I can't just jump into an airplane and pilot it, right? I have to have some level of training, or for instance, computer ops or conjuration, like with magic, right? So you can't use those unless you are trained. Now, in your character creation process, you can also select something called advantages and disadvantages, and these are actually optional rules. You don't have to use these, but most people do, and it kind of gives your character a little more flavor. So for instance, in here, in these advantages list, you'll see things like, for instance, combat sense. If you have that advantage, you're never surprised. Or natural armor, which gives you +4 to toughness. That's important, right, for not getting hurt. But all of these have to be matched up against compensations. And there's a compensation list and includes things like, bad luck or, an enemy or something along those lines. and you have to select them within the same column. For instance, if you take a column 3 advantage, you have to take a column 3 compensation. So it has to be balanced out. So if we look back at our fantasy warrior, we'll notice we see her derived attributes, right? She has a 10 toughness based on her attributes and some skill adds and advantages, things she has. She also has, there's a description here. She has her equipment, and there's a combat box up here with a K and an O on it. I'll explain that in a moment. And then there are wound levels and something called shock capacity. Okay, so that brings us then, to make any sense of this at all, that brings us to combat. So let me bring this up, and let's go over to combat. Now, how does combat work in this game? So let's say CIA agent Frank McIntyre is shooting at a KGB officer. So Frank rolls to get a bonus number, and he wants to compare that against his fire combat skill. And let's say he gets a bonus, and his skill total, remember the skill total is the bonus number or negative added to or subtracted to your skill, or your skill plus your specialization. So let's just say Frank's skill total is a 16. Now the KGB officer's dodge is 11. So we're going to compare these two numbers, and we're going to see immediately that Frank rolled a 16 versus an 11, which means it's 5 over what he needed to hit the KGB officer. So he gets what we call 5 initial result points. This is kind of similar to some RPG systems that use this idea of rolling above what you need and then using that as kind of bonus, right? Now, in this case, the pistol that Frank is using does 14 damage. We add the result points, right, the plus 5, to the 14 damage of the pistol to give us 19 total. But we then compare that against the resistance or the toughness of the KGB officer in this case. So let's say he has 9 toughness. We subtract the toughness from the total that Frank got to give us 10 final result points. It sounds a little bit convoluted, but it really isn't, because you'll get used to it. It's just kind of formulaic, right? You have to kind of work through these numbers. But here comes the ultimate crux of the whole matter. We now have to check the success chart to see what result we actually get. So we see that with 10 final result points, if we look on the damage column here for 10, we see it says 2 WND knockdown K3. What does that all mean? Well, it means that Frank has inflicted 2 wounds on the KGB agent. He's knocked him down. He's given him a K condition, which has to do with it being knocked out, and 3 shock damage. Now, this what we can do is I'm going to move forward here and talk about how some of this stuff works. Every number here in this damage column ends, or every entry in the damage column ends with a number. So for instance, knockdown 03 or wound KO5. The number at the end is the number of shock points that you actually inflict or suffer. So a PC can endure shock up to his endurance or his resist shock, or her resist shock, before going unconscious. So think about it like this. A boxer, in the course of a match, is in the 12th round, and he hasn't suffered any serious wounds, right? He doesn't have like a gash above his eye, he's bleeding out, or broken ribs, but he's in kind of banged around, and his endurance is failing him. He's getting exhausted, right? This is the shock. And once it's exhausted, you fall unconscious. And shock is healed at 1 point per every 10 seconds. And after it is all healed, the PC will regain consciousness. So when you lose all your shock, you go unconscious, and you have to get it all back before you become conscious again. Now, what about this KO entry here? If a PC gets a K or an O condition, he or she circles that off the sheet. So we saw that in the sheet, right, with a KO on our Fantasy Warrior. If you take both a K and an O, you go unconscious for a minute, and it takes 30 minutes to recover one of these Ks and Os. If you suffer a K and then another K, you suffer 2 shock damage. Also, if you look on this success chart, you'll see some things that say, for instance, like K/O. So that simply means that if you have suffered a K, you'll get an O, and vice versa. Knockdown. What happens when you're knocked down? Well, you suffer -4 on all actions for the rest of the round and the next. Now, before we get to wounds, let's look back at our battle or our combat example. Now, let's say Frank thinks the agent's dead, and he kind of walks up there, or he gets too close in his effort to inspect the body, but the KGB agent tries to stab him with a knife. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. It's same kind of thing, roll to attack. It'll be based on the skill level or maybe a specialization if he has it knife. We'll get a bonus number. And let's say the KGB agent gets 3 result points. But this time the damage is going to be a bit different because the knife does not have a set damage like the pistol, right? The pistol was damage of 14. The knife, the damage for that is strength +3. So this is kind of interesting. Depending on your strength, it's going to determine how much damage you do. So strength +3, and let's say the agent has an 8 strength, the damage would be 11, right? And let's say he gets 3 result points, so that equals a 14. That 14 minus 9 for the toughness of Frank McIntyre, right, our CIA agent, gives us a 5. And our final result then is on the chart here would be a knockdown 03. So Frank would be knocked down. He would take an O condition and 3 shock points. But let's say Frank is wearing a Kevlar vest, which gives him +3 to his toughness. Now, the final result would only be a 2, right? It would subtract from the damage, which is a K1. So Frank doesn't get knocked down. He does not suffer an O, doesn't get an O, he does get a K, but he only suffers 1 shock point. Now, modifying the difficulty number to hit. If a target is wounded and moving slowly, for instance, the GM could apply a -3 to the difficulty number. Easier to hit a wounded opponent. You can also specify a specific body part that you want to hit, but it's going to introduce a penalty. For instance, if I aim for the head, it's -8 to hit, but if I do hit, I'll do +12 damage. Abdomen, if I try to go for the abdomen, it'll be -4 to hit, but it's going to give +6 damage. So you can do these kind of called shots, but they are going to introduce a challenge to you. There are range modifiers for weapons like bows and spears. Those have to be taken into account. There's also cover, this kind of thing. But I won't get too deep into that because just by virtue of how much time we have. Now, what about wounds? Let's take a look at the wound levels. So if you suffer, you can suffer a certain number of wounds before you're simply dead. So for instance, if you suffer 1 wound, you're lightly wounded. If you get 3 wounds, you're heavily wounded. If 5 wounds, you're mortally wounded. And this is going to impact how your character is going to be able to proceed. So for instance, moderate wound level means -2 to all your physical skills, and the healing rate is 1 day. If you're heavily wounded, it's -4 to physical and -2 to all other skills. Right? So those might be, computer ops. It could be, operating heavy machinery, piloting a plane. You're going to get -2 to everything if you're heavily wounded, right? You might be bleeding out. Incapacitated, -8. Mortal, right? Automatic KO. And then, of course, if you're dead, you're dead, right? If you get to that level. Now, you're going to notice here on the right-hand column, we have healing difficulty. This is one of my favorite things about the system. A NPC or PC can use healing skills like medicine or first aid or whatever to try to heal someone, but they're going to have to roll. It's a complex action, and they're going to have to roll to see if they can beat that difficulty number in order to heal the person, and it's harder. The difficulty number is higher based on how wounded the character or the person they're trying to heal is. Very different than most systems, where most systems just like, oh, roll, do a first aid check and okay, the guy's healed, or cast cure critical wounds or whatever. Oh, he's just healed. It's a lot more difficult to heal people in this game based on the level of injury that they have sustained. Now, let me bring one more thing up here. There is something called an interactive attack table. Let's see if I can bring this up. I'm going to talk about it while I get into it. Everything isn't just combat. There are interactions between PCs and their environment, other people that they encounter in the course of the adventure. And with interaction, you use your skills that you have, for instance, like your skills that are based on confidence, like intimidation, or let's say agility skills. See if this comes up here. I was having some problems bringing it up, but I'll just talk about it while it's doing that. You can have an agility skill, for instance, like maneuver. And if you try to maneuver on somebody, you're either getting around them or you're doing something to kind of take them off of their game. So you would do your maneuver skill against their maneuver or their agility skill. And you're going to get different outcomes. I'll bring this up. You're going to get different outcomes based on how successful you are. So for instance, on this maneuver column, if I am successful in maneuvering, doing a maneuver against my enemy, I might make him fatigued, which means he takes 2 shock points. Or he could be stymied. Remember I talked about stymied? That's when you actually lose your next reroll attempt. Or you might be stymied and fatigued. And if you roll high enough, it'll just be player's call, what they want to do. You can also use something like trick. The trick skill would be your willpower or your intellect. I'm sorry, actually your trick skill against the willpower or intellect of the enemy. And then you can get results with that. Confidence, like I said, intimidation, which would be against willpower. And the effects you can get through intimidation might be stymied or something called untrained. If somebody's untrained, if they have that condition, they lose their skills and specializations. Or you can get a setback condition where something bad happens is GM's discretion. Break, which means the enemy runs, right? Kind of panics and runs. So those are the interaction skills that you can do in this game. And what I'm going to do is I have a Masterbook cheat sheet that I'm going to put in the show notes, which tells you exactly how to conduct, for instance, combat rounds, interaction rounds, how to deal with time and movement and this kind of thing. But one thing it references that's very interesting is something called the MasterDeck. Now, the MasterDeck is this deck of cards that was released by West End Games, and it's still actually, you can get it through Precis Intermedia, are these cards which can introduce new elements into the game, and they can also control like the initiative. They can be used for bonuses, to apply bonuses or negatives, and they're very, very interesting. And I'm going to do an entirely separate episode just on the MasterDeck because it's kind of its own animal. But the coolest thing about it, and one of the reasons why I love it, is that players can use the cards in the course of a scene, let's say a combat encounter or interactive or whatever, even if it isn't their turn. So for instance, if I have a card that says, +2 to agility for that player, I can give that to another one of the players if he's actually acting, it's his initiative segment and it's not my own. So players can kind of collaborate. But again, I will talk about that more when we get to the master deck. So that's one of the reasons why this game is great. The master deck allows you to have a situation where players can act when it isn't their turn, so I'm not waiting 20 minutes. I like the fact that healing wounds and medical conditions is more difficult depending on how wounded a person is. The dice only explode if you have a specialization. Remember I mentioned that. Most systems, including D6 and some other systems, have exploding dice, really regardless of whether or not you're particularly good at a particular thing. This mitigates that a bit by using the exploding dice only if you have a skill or a specialization in that area. So these are the core rules. Let's see if I missed anything. So I talked about interaction. There's tricks and stuff that you can do. The way really to approach this game is use all of these, these 8 attributes, all these skills, all these specializations, and kind of pit them against each other. Don't think of combat just as swinging a sword or shooting a gun. Also use like taunt, trick, maneuver, intimidate, these kind of things in the course of a scene or an encounter to spice things up, and then it even gets even better if you use the cards. So this really gives you a lot of options as a player and a game master. So also what I did promise is a quick unboxing of basically the limited edition Masterbook. So let's take a look at that real quick. All right, everyone, this is the rare limited edition of the Masterbook system, along with 2 other supplements or settings, Indiana Jones and Blood Shadows, that came out back in 1994. And this is only the 3rd released for these. And I believe there's only like maybe 15 or 20 of these that were ever made. And you'll see it's signed by the authors like Ed Stark and the designer Stephen Crane. And in here, it's almost 450 pages of material that includes not only the core rules, but also has, for instance, Indiana Jones, as I mentioned, and it also has the Blood Shadows fantasy noir setting. So this is a really neat thing if you can find it. Otherwise, of course, you can just get the regular Masterbook system through Precis or Precis Intermedia. Okay, so that is the Masterbook rules episode. Very crunchy, but that's okay, because what we're going to do is in future episodes, we're going to talk about, for instance, like Indiana Jones, Species, all of these settings separately. We're also going to talk about some rules that might come into play that are specific to the settings, like Necroscope, right? There might be like ESP powers and things like that. But this is will serve as kind of your primer to come back to, along with the cheat sheet that I will append to this episode to basically explain how these rules work, so those settings aren't so complicated and so daunting. With that, if you like what we're doing here, please like and subscribe. We're trying to give you quality content here, no nonsense, so you can better play games that are a little bit off the beaten track, not played as much, and alternatives to things like 5th edition, which most people play, right? I think there's a lot of great games out there, including this one.